Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Shannon de Rehove. With me in studio today is environmentalist and author Dr Anthony Turton, who will be discussing his new book, Shaking Hands with Billy. Welcome, Doctor. Now, your book, Shaking Hands with Billy, reads as a tour de force of covert operations in South African history. What inspired you to write the book at a time when so many would like to forget what happened?
Well, it's precisely the fact that we want to forget what happened that I think is the danger. And I think it's a big mistake that we should forget, because we came through a very, very turbulent period of our history. It wasn't glorious by any stretch of imagination. And out of that turbulence, all we can remember is the bad stuff. And the bad stuff is really what emerged into the public domain after initially the Catharsis Commission of Inquiry into effectively illegal activities by security forces. So all we remember from that time is just the absolute bad news, murder by the state, etc., etc. That's not the true story. That's not the entire story. That's part of the story. I believe that one thing we've learned from history is that we learn nothing from history. We tend to want to forget about the past, and therefore we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. And what concerns me very much at the moment in our young democracy is that we are starting to see a mutation, a malignant mutation of that democracy into what I call a kleptocracy. And unless we really take note and stand up and say that some of these things are simply unacceptable because they affect us all, I think we are going to eventually slide down that slippery slope again. So the reason why it was written was firstly to capture for historic purposes those moments in time. I was actually mandated by a group of officers that served with me. They felt that the time was now right for the story to be told. It couldn't have been told a couple of years ago. It was just not, the timing simply wasn't right about it. And you'll notice that nowhere do I glorify any of these things, nowhere do I glorify violence. I'm a product of that. In fact, I write in there that my character was forged on the anvil of Africa by the hammer of endemic violence. I believe that as a nation we've been forged like that. And I believe as a nation we might think that we are totally normal, but actually we're not. We are a very unique nation in many, many ways because we've been forged in this way. So we need to look back at our history, we need to understand where we've come from, to learn those lessons. A healthy democracy is one that learns, just like a healthy institution is one that learns. So I've put that information forward, not to glorify it, not to kiss and tell, not to do any of those sensational things, simply as a humble attempt to try and understand it myself. And hopefully to try and present it to others in a way that they can also understand.
Now, the book is written in three narratives: your personal history, the history of the Chief Directorate, covert operations, and a look into the future. Why did you write it in this way?
Well, it started in a very, very funny way. There was a point in my life when I left the country, a very, very difficult period in my life when my career came to an end within the intelligence services. You must appreciate that I dedicated my absolute everything to helping our young democracy happen in the first place. When things came unstuck, there's a chapter there that I talk about when things fall apart. I wrote that with a very heavy heart because I didn't want it to be a sensational chapter, but I decided eventually that it was very important to write that chapter because the intelligence services were always ahead of the game. We were a decade or two ahead of the rest of development within society. And I feel that Things Fall Apart chapter is an important chapter because it helps to understand why things are going wrong now as well. Because in essence, things fall apart when we lose sight of the fact that we've come from this turbulent past, when we lose sight of the fact that in the struggle, in the negotiation that ended the struggle, we reached out to each other across the divide. It was that enormous spirit of cooperation, that enormous goodwill. Some people might want to call it Ubuntu, but there was that enormous intangible thing that we had, which we just swept away under President Thabo Mbeki. He simply swept it away. So I found myself at a very difficult point in my life, not knowing where to go. There was a lot of witch hunting happening out there as a result of all these revelations from the Catharsis Commission of Inquiry and later on the Goldstone Commission of Inquiry, then the Truth Commission. All of these, there was a witch hunt out there, and if you were involved in the security forces in any way, you were stigmatized very, very deeply. So most people just put their head down, they pulled their head into their tortoise shell and they just carried on with their lives. And I was living in kind of self-imposed exile in London, where I met a number of profound people, and one of them was a man called Major General Timothy Toynsiwo, who was the commandant of Sandhurst Military College and who now features quite prominently in the activities of Lewis Pugh, and also met Lewis Pugh at the same time in London. And it was in that sort of period of time that Major General Sewell said to me, interesting story, have you written your memoirs? And that's really where the idea first took root. And I decided to start writing the things down as my personal narrative, to hold myself accountable to my children. Because unfortunately I was in intense operations for a long period of time. So in effect, my children grew up without knowing me. We've got a very, very close family even to this day, but my children grew up in an abnormal environment because they just learned to never ask what their father was doing, etc., etc. So it was a very strange environment, and I'm very grateful to my wife that she kept it all together. I'm very grateful to my children that they turned out as sensible people at the end of the day. So the journey to write this story started out with the intention to just get the noise out of my head, just to download it. Once it's on a piece of paper, you can distance yourself from it. You can say, is it good or bad, or did I behave reasonably or not? Hold myself accountable. But then this book came into the possession of some of my colleagues from the same unit that I served with, COVID operations. And they said, wow, they want it as well, because it's such a secret world. No one really knows about it, and the community that lives in that world are very intensely linked to each other, because there's that sense of trust between each other. There's that sense of shared experiences and shared danger. So there's an enormous amount of networking taking place within that community. And they then said, right, they wanted copies. So the second iteration came out. But what's interesting about that was, in that, they wanted the story of the Chief Director of COVID Operations to be told. So that story then started coming out. And you must appreciate that I can't tell the whole story because I don't know the whole story. It is simply a strange thing about that kind of structure, that it is so compartmented and so secret that the left hand often doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But then a third thing started emerging, and that third thing I think is far more important. You cannot understand the story of an individual unless you understand the story of the society in which that person is embedded. And for me, that came out when I was deployed as a soldier, before I became an operator in special operations. When I was in the townships, I happened to be in the first group of soldiers that was deployed into the townships. We were actually pulled out of we were supposed to be deployed into Angola at that point in time, and we were turned around because we were the most combat-ready unit. And that was an absolute horrific experience. And for me, that became the watershed experience. And I write about it in the book in a one short story called The 1,000-Yard Stare. And that 1,000-yard stare for me, that was my iconic moment. That was the moment that I think I changed forever. Because that was the moment that I realized that we are all individuals operating in places where we've got absolutely no control. The only thing we can control is our immediate actions under conditions of absolute chaos. When I say absolute chaos, it was quite acceptable to shoot first and ask questions later. So the one thing that comes out, which I certainly hope comes out, is the issue of restraint. This issue of, I refer to this thin grey line. The thin grey line is really sanity. For me, it was sanity, but it was also the moral integrity of the individual. And you cannot understand the one without the other, because for me, sitting here today, it's a completely alien environment to what I've actually spent a large portion of my life in. So how do you judge my actions? Do you judge my actions by sitting here with a tie around my neck, or do you judge my actions in the field, with shots coming in around my ears? And that's really what I try to do. I try to put the person that hasn't experienced that into the intimate space through some of those short stories.
Now tell me, what do you think South Africans, or what do you hope South Africans will achieve by reading your story, as well as what you hope to achieve through telling it?
Well, what I've tried to achieve through telling it is simply catharsis. I've exercised all the demons in my head. You must appreciate that people that have come through those kind of experiences, and there are many of them. I network in an environment where, on the one hand, I've got a deeply professional environment, and that's one world, and then there's another world, and these are all veterans from both sides of the struggle. And all of those veterans that have been at the very sharp edge of the struggle are all profoundly impacted in one way or another. So that sense of catharsis, that sense of respect, just respecting the other. And in fact, I think one of the things I've tried to do in the book is to show empathy, because it's very easy to dehumanize yourself. And in that story, 1,000 Yard Stare, I talk there about how my soul, how my spirit left my body. That is the only way I could survive at that moment in time, because it was just such a horrific experience watching someone burning. It was absolutely chaotic. So the only way you can survive is to, in fact, distance yourself. So in distancing yourself, you dehumanize yourself. So for me, the process of rehumanization, the process of finding dignity back in our society, is the process of recognizing that we are but individuals and we are fallible, but recognizing with empathy the plight of your enemy. I think to me that this has been the most profound thing, respecting my enemy, not having anger, not having malice, not having hatred, because so many of the veterans are fueled by that. So what I would like to do, hopefully, is to reach out to those people, because they are part of our society. The miracle of South Africa was the TRC. The miracle in South Africa are the many things that we did. We're the only country in the world where a government voluntarily negotiated itself out of power in the best interest of society. Nowhere else in the world has that taken. That is a remarkable story. We are the only place in the world where a prisoner of conscience actually looked at his jailer and said, "You, my jailer, are as much a victim as I am." I mean, that is just an incredible story. Okay, we are the only place in the world that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Nowhere else in the world have they gone that far to try and bridge the divides. We're the only nation in the world where a military force that had chemical, biological and nuclear weapons voluntarily relinquished them. We're the only former nuclear nation that is no longer a nuclear nation. So we are a remarkable people. And what we have today now, emerging from our television sets and from the daily newspapers, is a new rhetoric. And it's this new rhetoric which I think is so dangerous. It's this shallow struggle rhetoric about kill the Boer. And it's about Mshiniwami. And it's about this rolling mass action type of sentiment we're going to, which I think is extremely dangerous. And what we need is to go back to the vibrancy of our young democracy, to the Freedom Charter that spoke about a non-racial democracy in which everyone could reach their full potential. That is a noble ideal, and that is something that I think we should all subscribe to.
Now, finally, I think what we all need to know is, who is Billy and why are you shaking his hand?
Okay, well, Billy goes back to a very, very, to me, the turning point in our history. Just as we had 9/11 that changed the world history when someone flew an aeroplane into the World Trade Center, the Pretoria car bomb was our 9/11. When the Pretoria car bomb went off, it was a very, very violent act that took place right in the heart of our capital city. And a decision was made in the security force structures, the very, very senior level at that point in time, that we are going to avenge that attack. That was our 9/11. And at that point in time, I was recruited out of a military unit. I'd been involved in an armored fighting unit up until then. And a special operations unit was created under National Intelligence Service called the Chief Directorate Covert Operations, also known as Chief Directorate K. And they created a unit K43, and K43 was given the task of bringing to justice the person that authorized that Pretoria car bomb. And the operation was based on Israeli Mossad action to go and capture Adolf Eichmann, which is a well-documented case. In fact, we learned from everything we could from that operation. And Billy was, in fact, the Chief of Staff of Mkhonto Sizwe, MK, because it was believed by the security force elites that he had authorized this operation. And we were tasked to track him down and to capture him and bring him back and put him on trial. We were not allowed to shoot him. There were many occasions when we could have done just that, but the mission was to track him down, to capture him, to put him in court, to put him on in front of a judge. That was the whole thing. And now you must appreciate he was operating outside of South Africa, so we had to launch a number of very, very serious, very, very complex operations to try and track him down, to put him under surveillance. And he was given the code name of Billy. And when we were in a position to capture him, we had to send a signal back to headquarters, we can now shake hands with Billy. And that would then trigger the next phase of the operation. The first phase was the surveillance phase. The second phase was the capture phase. And there's a whole lot of technical things that happened there, and so that's what Shaking Hands with Billy was about. But initially it was a hardcore military thing, but later on it came to symbolize to me the engagement. Because ultimately I never shook hands with Billy, because Billy, we never captured him. In fact, he became a member of parliament, and in my view, a very good member of parliament later on, and a very dignified man. Although he was ideologically poles apart from me, he was my enemy before, but nonetheless, I still have a lot of respect for him. So ultimately, Billy came to me to represent us as South Africans coming to terms with our awkward and complex history, and particularly the things that had always driven my generation: indifference. We just ignorance, we just didn't care about others, we just didn't know about these alternatives, and injustice. Those three: indifference, ignorance and injustice. And that's ultimately what it's about. So Shaking Hands with Billy is a metaphor at the end of the day for our national reconciliation, which I believe is still not over. I believe we have to go back to nation building in a big way.
Well, thank you so much for your chat, Anthony. It was great to speak to you.
Thank you very much.
That was author Dr. Anthony Turton discussing his new book, Shaking Hands with Billy.